Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's HIS Talk webinar, Healthcare Organizations, Operationalizing Data Science Models. It's brought to you by CitiusTech. I'm Lori from HIS Talk and I'll be moderating. We have two speakers today. First up will be Yugal Sharma. Yugal is the Vice President of Data Science at CitiusTech. He leads the Data Science and Consulting Proficiency Groups. Joining Yugal will be Vinil Menon. Vinil is the Vice President of Enterprise Applications Proficiency at CitiusTech. He's responsible for product engineering, QA, cloud, development operations, and mobile practices. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Yugal.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining our webinar today. We'll be discussing operationalizing data science models in healthcare. So I thought we'd just start off with some quick introductions. So as mentioned, I'm Yugal Sharma. I'm the lead for our data science practice at CitiusTech. In terms of background, I have about 17 years experience in the data science space, both as a scientist and as a consultant leveraging predictive analytics and machine learning approaches in healthcare space. Before CitiusTech, I spent some time in Big Four consulting, delivering advanced analytics services and strategy to clients in the pharma and biotech space. And before then, I did my postdoc and I was a government scientist at the National Institutes of Health, focusing on developing AI algorithms to detect subclinical disease states. Looking forward to the discussion today. And with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague Vinil for a quick introduction.
Thank you, Yugal. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure speaking to you this morning. My name is Vinil Menon, and I'm the CTO at CitiusTech. I am also the business lead for enterprise applications and responsible for practices including cloud and DevOps. I have nearly 2 decades experience in the industry, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Great, thanks, Vinil. So before we dive in, I actually wanted just to give some context to the type of work we do at CitiusTech for those who aren't familiar. So we're a technology services firm focused exclusively in the healthcare space. So we work with clients, payers, providers, pharma, life science companies. We work across the entire healthcare data lifecycle, providing services such as clinical data integration, performance management, enterprise architecture, cloud services, BI, and enterprise data warehouse services, as well as advanced analytics and data science support. We have about 3,000 professionals globally, including 1,200 engineers, HL7 certified professionals. We have about 200 plus data scientists and consultants globally, with strong growth over the last 5 years. We have about 80 healthcare customers currently across the payer, provider, and medtech space. So with that background, today we'll be covering sort of a high-level overview of how to effectively operationalize data science models and what that means for those who aren't familiar with the space. We'll present some best practices and approaches on how to deploy, evaluate, monitor, and manage developed models within a healthcare organization. And then we'll follow this with some real-life examples and a summary of key takeaways. So our hope is that by the end of this talk, you'll be able to get some familiarity with operationalizing data science models in healthcare organizations, assess best practices for deploying models, articulate best practices and solutions for evaluating and monitoring models within your organization, evaluate current approaches and frameworks for model management, and finally describe best practices for integrating models within the organization's application development process. So slide 5, what you're seeing here kind of gives an overview of our agenda for the talk. We're going to begin by discussing some industry trends in healthcare around data science. And from there, we'll give an overview of the data science lifecycle and examples of use cases in the healthcare industry, along with the introduction to model operationalization and some definitions. And we use that foundation to talk about challenges and best practices when operationalizing models. Vinil will then give some background on common technology platforms that can help with this process. And then we'll talk about a couple of real-life case studies where we put some of these ideas into practice. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a summary of key takeaways from the talk. So with that, let's just jump right in. So data science actually has a lot of definitions, I'm sure as the audience is aware. But in general, we can view it as an intersection between statistics, analysis, computational techniques used to derive insights from data. So data science has become really important. It's a relatively strong buzzword in the industry and become really relevant in recent years. Healthcare organizations are becoming better at collecting and storing healthcare data, such as electronic medical records or claims data, largely due to decreased cost of data storage and commoditization of data collection technologies. And now the key is really to start leveraging structured approaches to unlock the value hidden within the data. So the data science market is projecting massive growth in coming years. Looking at providers as an example, we see a trend towards leveraging predictive modeling, where most of the use cases are to predict patient disease progression or illness, with additional data also becoming available, such as socioeconomic data or behavioral data. This could augment traditional data capture, and other use cases are starting to become prevalent, such as predicting readmissions or identifying patients at risk for no-show. These are becoming more common and help to drive things like operational efficiency and help to improve costs. So a recent study showed that some of the key drivers, one of the major ones was rising healthcare costs. And this is really underlying a push to start doing more with less. And this is becoming a general trend in the healthcare industry. So with computational resources becoming cheaper, more complex algorithms and technologies are starting to become within reach to extract even more meaningful insights from data. The hope is to be able to use these data insights to help increase operational efficiencies and drive down costs and improve outcomes for patients. So for example, a recent study has shown that no-shows and cancellations within a hospital represent 31% of overall scheduled appointments. Using predictive analytics, you can start identifying patients at risk for no-shows to help increase efficiency and drive down costs by targeting these particular high-risk patients with assistance or specific interventions like transportation services. So another example is around, in terms of drivers, is around implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So using COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, as an example area, there's a specific provision of the ACA that attempts to address increasing costs by reducing hospital readmissions in COPD patients. So there's a program, the Hospital Readmissions Reduction Program, which defines rules that require CMS to reduce payments to hospitals with excess COPD readmissions. And what this does is give medical institutions financial incentive to start reducing hospital readmissions. So the availability of claims data, EMR data, and other data that can be used to augment, coupled with these available computational resources, then allow for the creation of predictive models that can identify patients at risk for readmission to help plan for targeted interventions to reduce costs and improve outcomes. So moving on to slide 7, even with this current push towards leveraging data science in healthcare, there's some major challenges that are currently faced by data scientists and business executives. So usually due to the limited resources or limited understanding of the data itself, there's a large amount of data. The large amount of data that's available actually makes it challenging to identify the correct data science approach and requires skill sets, especially within organizations that are new to data science. So for example, given the large number of patients in a typical EMR system, traditional statistical approaches might not be enough to start identifying characteristics of patients at risk for developing a particular illness that can form the basis for developing a predictive model. So really understanding the data and bringing in some of these advanced techniques becomes important. And even for healthcare organizations that are successfully developing models, a good number of these models are actually never deployed within the organization. It's typically due to a lack of resources or lack of internal buy-in or a mismatch in the skills required to incorporate the model into the organization's infrastructure. So really, essentially, the key challenges revolve around one or more of the following areas. So issues with the data itself, challenges with developing the model, technical challenges integrating the model within the organization's infrastructure, and a really properly defined business value of the data science initiative. So data science has now grown from an art to more of a complex, highly structured approach. And for any data science initiative to be successful, it's really the proper operationalization of existing models that's the key to alignment of these 4 areas around the data, the model, the infrastructure, and the business value. So now we'll talk a little bit about the data science lifecycle and where model operationalization fits in, and then why it's so important. So before stepping into granular detail, we wanted to set some context and give a quick overview of what data science and what operationalization is to help sort of set the tone for our conversation today. So data science is the understanding of the past and predicting the future to help drive better decision making. Operationalization, for our purposes, we're defining it as a process of deploying, evaluating, monitoring, and managing models for efficient consumption by stakeholders. So typically, predictive models are built by data scientists, and then the businesses use those models to consume them for predictive actions. So an example of this is, there's currently several industry standard models that have been developed to help predict patients at risk for developing sepsis in a hospital setting. So this information is then used to target high-risk patients with early interventions to help improve outcomes and help drive down costs, since some of the later interventions tend to be very expensive. So that's from a development standpoint, but data science is actually more than just the development of models. We'll talk about some important steps both before and after the model development process, and this will help determine the success of any given data science initiative. And before jumping into the life cycle, I wanted to talk a little bit about a quick overview of types of use cases that exist in healthcare, just to get an idea of what the landscape looks like. So the way that this diagram is structured, so moving to the right along this diagram, these add additional complexity in the underlying algorithms. And then below we get some examples of the types of insights that we gain by leveraging data science for these particular use cases. So at the most basic, we have retrospective analysis, which is really, and a lot of times, just simple descriptive statistics on data sets. This can be something like comparing providers against quality metrics or performing industry benchmarking for performance or something along those lines. Adding in complexity, you can start identifying existing patterns in data sets to generate insight. And here, you're talking about things like segmenting patients according to risk, for example, or identifying claims that are subject to underpayments or claims subject to fraud, waste, and abuse. And so from here, this is where predictive capability can be brought in. And this is where the development of predictive modeling actually occurs. And some examples here are something we've talked a little bit before about predicting readmissions or predicting length of stay, or looking at mortality, with the goal of aiding clinical decision making. And finally, building off of sort of the predictive analytics piece is prescriptive analytics, which allows for scenario testing to identify best interventions based on predictions of future trends. And this includes predicting disease progression and combining that with, for example, potential intervention scenarios, or identifying high-risk patients along with treatment recommendations. So, the point here is really that healthcare organizations need to understand the whole spectrum of how data science can address these increasingly complex questions to really provide business value and derive, the necessary insights from the underlying data. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about the data science lifecycle. And so for the purpose of our talk, so the end-to-end data lifecycle, data science lifecycle encompasses phases that span from data preparation to model development, to then model operationalization, which is the focus of this talk, and then finally business consumption, which is the use of reporting or dynamic dashboards to help consume model outputs to drive decisions. So our discussion will focus on exploring challenges, best practices, and frameworks for model operationalization within an organization. And to help put this into context, if we take our sepsis example from earlier, for predicting patients at risk for developing sepsis within a hospital setting, you can think of it as a 4-stage process according to this life cycle. So this would involve, as a first step, extracting, cleaning, and possibly de-identifying electronic medical record data, for example. Then using this data to build predictive models to segment patients at risk for developing sepsis in the ICU. Then you would deploy this model. For example, you may integrate it into the reporting layer of an EMR system, and then subject the model to regular evaluation and monitoring to refine the model over time. And then the output of the model is pushed to existing dashboards that could underpin an early warning system to identify patients at risk for developing sepsis, so the staff can execute early intervention protocols to help improve outcomes. So drilling down and looking at operationalization specifically, sort of begs the question, what is operationalization? So for this talk, we're defining operationalization as a next step following model development, and then leveraging these models to ensure they're scalable within an organization and provide the necessary business value by meeting the needs of stakeholders. So why operationalize a model? Why is this so important? The goal of operationalizing models is to share the model outputs within the organization and make these outputs available to everyone. There's a need to review the model and monitor its performance over time, and then react to that monitoring of the model and react to that performance to improve the quality of model outputs and then update the model as needed. So to get specific, we define model operationalization as 4 distinct steps. So once a model is developed, it must be deployed. And what we mean by this is taking the model from a development environment into a specific production environment, which may be a different technology stack. In our sepsis example that we talked about before, this would involve integrating an existing predictive model into, for example, electronic medical record reporting layer. The next step is to evaluate the deployed model. And here we're looking at the performance of the model in the production environment with respect to defined metrics. And we'll talk about some of these in a bit. And then we monitor the model over time. And so we look at the performance to ensure the model is performing as expected or per defined requirements. And here we're defining thresholds with respect to these performance metrics and then acting on those thresholds. And that's really the managing piece at the end, which is reacting to different performance metric thresholds and instituting corrective actions if the model is performing below expectations. So this could involve, recalibrating the model or rebuilding the model as necessary. Again, looking at our sepsis example, this model, as new patient data comes in, the model can be recalibrated and sort of becomes a learning platform over time where there's incremental improvements as new data comes in. And so these next few slides, we're going to talk about these areas sort of in more detail. So to get a better understanding, so we're looking at now these 4 stages of model operationalization from a schematic viewpoint. So this is specifically, the slide here is around model deployment. And so the idea is the model is trained and then evaluated using historical data, and then it's deployed into the production environment. Once the model is deployed, it's input with additional data in order to make predictions in the production environment. And here the performance of the model can be evaluated across any performance metric or multiple performance metrics. And we'll talk about how to define these in a bit. But some common ones that are listed here that you see within the industry are accuracy, precision, sensitivity, or area under the curve. And we'll talk about those in some more detail. And then finally, after the evaluation process, there's a monitoring process. And here is where thresholds are actually applied to the performance metrics that can trigger events based on model performance relative to defined thresholds. And so, for example, if the model is underperforming, there's corrective actions that can be taken in order to improve the model with additional data. Or this can take the form of either recalibrating or rebuilding the model. Again, we'll talk about that in some future slides. And finally, there's model management, which the model is then managed based on the performance metrics and thresholds. And again, as mentioned, the model can be retrained or can be rebuilt depending how well it's doing within the environment. And whether you rebuild or retrain the model, in both cases, the model then gets redeployed in the production environment. The process is then repeated. So hopefully that gave you a little bit more insight into kind of what model operationalization is. And that obviously is at a very high level. There's a lot of deeper technical detail that underpin a lot of that, which is sort of outside the scope of this discussion. So we'll now talk about some challenges and best practices for each of the 4 steps of model operationalization. So starting with deployment, there's typically 3 broad challenges in the deployment phase. So the first is really gaining an understanding of both the development and the deployment environment. So there are times when the environments may be different for technical reasons. So for example, again, going back to our sepsis example, model might be developed with open source tools such as R, Python, or perhaps even developed within a rapid prototyping environment such as MATLAB. The goal then is to integrate this model into an existing EMR system as part of the early warning system we discussed before, with those outputs being sent to dashboards. So in cases like this, we need to make the model portable enough to work across all environments. And several approaches exist to do this. There's APIs or exposing the model as web service, but we'll talk about that in the next slide. So another broad challenge for healthcare organizations is around sensitivity of data. And this is a well-known challenge in the industry, but it's important here as you're developing and deploying models to leverage existing resources within the organization to understand sort of what the constraints and compliance needs of the data that underpin the model, that'll drive how the model should be deployed. So for example, if there's PHI data that must reside in a specific secure location, that'll limit how the model can be deployed. In some cases, anonymization may be an option, but these will be driven by specific use cases. CitiusTech recently had a project where we're developing patient disease progression models, and this required the data to be anonymized in order for the model to be properly deployed. And so kind of related to this is a third challenge around ensuring that you have a correct team in place. And so this is actually one of the reasons why developed models are sometimes challenging to deploy. So in many cases, the skills required to build models, usually the models are built by data scientists, are distinct from those required to deploy models, which is typically data engineers or DevOps staff. When data scientists are left to deploy models, it constrains resources for model development. And so that becomes an important consideration. And then, an additional consideration for healthcare organizations is to ensure that there's data experts as part of the team that specialize in privacy and regulatory policies to ensure that models are utilizing data in a compliant fashion. So this slide actually has outlined some common strategies when deploying models, going from development to production environments. There's 4 kind of main strategies which are common in the industry. I'll just go over these very quickly. There's a lot of technical detail here, but I'll just keep this at a high level for this discussion. So the first is deploying the model in PMML format. And this is a predictive model markup language. It's basically an XML language that captures model metadata and characteristics, and then pulled in the production environment in order to ensure that across different. And the pros here, that means it's widely supported, and the model development and deployment become platform independent with this kind of an approach. And one of the cons is around this is limited support for computational models. So for the more advanced models, this doesn't have the sort of necessary requirements in order to deploy across environments. The next is around web services, and this is a more flexible approach. So here the custom models are built using whatever tool of choice, and then the models are packaged and deployed on an application server, exposing web services that can be called by various applications. So here, this is platform independent, scales well with a number of models, is an advantage. And some of the cons is there's less control if you're hosting web services on the cloud, since the environment isn't completely within your control. The next piece is around the in-database approach, and this is actually integration of data models into the data warehouse functionality. So this is a flexible approach. It leverages user-defined functions to actually score the model, and so that lends this approach a good deal of flexibility. Some of the pros here are that there's a wide variety of algorithms supported, and there's a reduced reliance on licensed software, since you can leverage open source technologies for this kind of an approach. The cons are there's an additional complexity when integrating integrating models within existing databases. And finally, the last one is a portable format for analytics. This is sort of a new standard in the industry, and it's meant to improve on PMML by allowing for more flexible support for advanced computational models. So the pros here are that there's a wide variety of algorithms here that are supported, there's easy integration into the data environment, and the major con is that it's still new and it's not widely supported, but we expect that to change over time as the industry evolves. So moving on to model evaluation and monitoring. So we've combined both of them here, since a lot of the challenges are common between the two. So the first sort of challenge area is typically there's a business disconnect when evaluating and monitoring models. So during this stage, a lot of times there can be too much emphasis on model performance and not enough on the business problem, especially if the metrics aren't defined in advance. So for example, again, talking about the sepsis example we've been discussing, the business challenge is trying to be solved should drive the model performance thresholds and the chosen performance metrics, since certain performance metrics can be tied to outcomes. So for example, looking at sensitivity and specificity, you expect that to relate to outcomes in some way. And so the metrics, the once you define these metrics, then they can be used to establish buy-in from stakeholders and then start driving the overall business objective. So once this threshold performance is reached, then incremental improvements to the model are appropriate. So then our challenge is that the model will typically degrade over time due to changes in the data landscape or business requirements. So evaluating and monitoring model performance on a regular basis is key to understanding the model dynamics, especially when incorporating new data. And so there's existing out-of-the-box tools that that should be leveraged when possible. And some examples of these are SAS Model Manager, IBM Collaboration and Deployment Services, and TensorFlow. And the first two are proprietary platforms, and TensorFlow is open source, and so it caters to a whole gamut of requirements within an organization. And finally, monitoring the model in this way, especially using some of these out-of-the-box solutions, allows for performance thresholds to be set. And depending on the level of degradation, alerts can be sent to engineering or DevOps teams, or alternatively, the data science team in case of extreme degradation that may require advanced modifications to the algorithm set or even the creation of a new model. So this slide lists some sort of common approaches and metrics when evaluating and monitoring models, or even comparing models to each other. So the most prevalent in the industry is the model discrimination metrics. And this approach establishes metrics to determine how well a model predicts events. This includes some of the metrics we discussed before around sensitivity, which is the true positive rate, specificity, which is a true negative rate, area under the curve, which is the optimized trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. You can look at accuracy, which is the total number of correct predictions, and precision, which can be thought of as a positive predictive value. So these metrics are really the most prevalent when assessing models developed by healthcare organizations. And in the case of models that predict, specifically around at-risk patients, looking at, for example, probability of risk factors for developing a particular illness or disease, the trade-off between sensitivity and specificity, or the area under the curve, this tends to be a dominant metric to evaluate performance and compare performance between models. So population stability takes into account the current data versus the data used during model development, and looks at the difference. So this difference then becomes the basis for assessing how stable the model is. So you can think of it as this really gives an evolutionary view of the model, so to speak, with respect to the data and how the data evolves over time. And finally, characteristic stability looks at the distribution of data as a function of each variable within the model for the development for development and then the production version, and determines its impact on model performance. So moving on to challenges in model management. So there's a few broad areas here that we wanted to touch on as well. So the first is, since healthcare organizations, they tend to be tightly regulated environments, especially around data, model transparency actually becomes a key challenge. This becomes an important consideration when choosing an approach or algorithm for solving a particular business challenge. We had an example here that probably helps put this into a little context. So we recently had a project with a large pharmaceutical organization to evaluate disease progression models that were developed in-house by a previous team. However, a lot of these models were developed using neural networks specifically, which is considered to be a black box approach. So what that means is typically, while it's effective for classification, it gives little insight into how the prediction itself is actually done. And so it was difficult to improve on these models without starting entirely from scratch, which was eventually what we had to do. The lack of transparency in the initial modeling effort was also a challenge within the organization for stakeholder buy-in, and actually the main reason why the initial project was discontinued. So this is another example, of how the business challenge should be the main driver of model design and transparency, even over approaches that may yield more effective performance. So the next piece is around model tracking. So this is also a key consideration. It's important to have a platform that's capable of managing multiple versions of a given model, or a set of models actually, for the purpose of audits and rollbacks. So especially as business priorities change, a previous version of the model may become more relevant. In these cases, having a model management platform can provide much of the needed functionality to ensure the models are managed efficiently. Some examples of model management systems, so there's H2O.ai, Microsoft R Server, SAS Model Manager. The first is open source, and the the latter two are proprietary. And so finally, the last point is around managing poor model performance. So depending on how bad or how good or bad the model performance is, a typical approach is to either recalibrate or rebuild the model completely. And this becomes especially important as models are automatically updated with new data. If you have it set up as for example, a continuous learning platform that takes in new data, adjusts parameters, and you monitor the performance in a cyclical manner. So as new data comes in, decisions must be made as to how to deal with underperformance, and we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So another way to think about model management is essentially version control for models. So different versions of the model can be stored within a model management platform for rollbacks or comparison between models. And when specifically around when they're underperforming, the models can be recalibrated, and they should be recalibrated when the underlying model assumptions are still valid, or you typically rebuild them when the underlying assumptions are invalidated. For example, with new business rules or updated data that contain additional dimensions that weren't used when the model was trained. So once the model is built or recalibrated, then it should be redeployed and updated in version control systems that get pushed into the production environment. So some examples of common out-of-the-box model management platforms, or we mentioned some of these before, the SAS model management, IBM collaboration and deployment services, and TensorFlow. And again, the first two are proprietary, and TensorFlow is an open source platform. And so the advantage of platforms like this is that they provide automated code management for updates and allow for triggers that can be used to monitor model performance. And that helps to aid, corrective actions as necessary. So slide 25, we talked a little bit, about some of the best practices for each of these areas. And there's one particular best practice that applies to operationalizing models sort of across the spectrum for all 4 steps. And the idea here is ensuring that when you're executing model operationalization steps, that you have a hybrid team versus having a few people who have multiple skill sets across the board, what we call unicorns. The issue with unicorns is that not only they're hard to find, they tend to be very expensive, and they represent a single point of failure. So the idea is to build a hybrid team consisting of, for example, data scientists, DevOps staff, data engineers, and healthcare privacy experts. And the latter actually becomes, important when dealing with healthcare data. We talked a little bit before about HIPAA constraints and necessity sometimes to de-identify sensitive data sets in a compliant fashion. So healthcare organizations usually have dedicated teams that focus on data usage and privacy policies. The point here is that these teams should be involved in the data science lifecycle and model operationalization steps as much as possible. So in fact, yesterday there was an article about how MD Anderson was hit with a $4.3 million fine for not following proper protocols for securing patient data. And this resulted in a breach of roughly 33,000 patient records. This really underscores the need for having data privacy experts being an integral part of any process that relies on sensitive data. So using this sort of hybrid approach allows for a much more flexible and not to mention cost-effective approach versus having 1 to 2 skilled individuals who can fit into a variety of roles. And we have an example here. We worked recently with a large healthcare provider who had a small in-house data science team, and they were challenged with deploying predictive models into their ecosystem. So as we talked to them, it became clear that the data scientists actually were being tasked with also operationalizing the models that they developed. And they had a very strong team. It was a small team, but they had really talented members with required skill sets sort of across the board. So data scientists that could also be data engineers and understood sort of data privacy. But the problem is they had no bandwidth to effectively update the models as needed in terms, when they're monitoring and sort of managing the models over time. So when they moved to more of a hybrid team approach, the efficiency and more importantly, the quality of sort of the modeling efforts went up dramatically. And this was just from adding 1 to 2 additional resources. So with that, I'll hand it over to Vinil, and he can give an overview of the technology and platforms that are common in operationalized models. So Vinil, over to you.
Thank you, Yuval. Moving on to the next slide. Across the world, software development teams are rapidly adopting DevOps as a fundamental paradigm to deliver features faster to customers. That same process model that works for large-scale enterprise development can be adapted to model management with a few tweaks to deployment and management of models. Such a process framework needs 3 stages. The first stage comprising of the infrastructure management around the model, the second stage around managing the release process of the model, and the third stage around feedback and optimization. In the infrastructure stage, the model delivery benefits from having a standardized configurable infrastructure relevant to run the model to well-defined and acceptable performance metrics. The ability to automate that infrastructure, knowing what infrastructure is to be deployed for that model, build to build by maintaining a configuration management database, the ability to roll back via automated recovery, and finally, the ability to isolate as well as scale up via containerization. In the release stage, the deployment pipeline is actually exercised and customized as per each build's requirements. This could be around different builds for production versus UAT environments, builds specific to customer type. It could be specific to workload types. And this may also require managing parallel versions of the builds. In the feedback and optimization stage, the primary activities are monitoring and feedback. The monitoring activity is actually looking for changes between or among the build-to-build cycle, the cycle times themselves, and looking at the frequently changing components and then updating the feedback into the system to optimize those. And the success of such a framework depends on close collaboration between the development, the data science, and the operations team. Moving on to the next slide. The software world today is using a wide variety of tools across the DevOps continuum. Model development teams working closely with the engineering teams must encompass the same process, bringing the data science process and tools into its fold. So while the data science team continues to use the tools they are familiar with, their outputs and activities are segregated and aligned to the development team's phases. And the output of each phase feeds into the same process and rigor that the development team follows, including setting up tools that can provide the necessary feedback. So some of the techniques that you will spoke about must be integrated into this process. Moving on to the next slide, let's look at some of the high-level considerations around choosing an appropriate deployment model. Traditionally, models have been developed, trained, deployed, and managed entirely on-premise. The advantage of an entirely on-prem model is the managed cost, knowing what is the environment that the model is executed on, and the ability to control the entire process in a repeatable manner fairly easily. When it comes to deploying on the cloud provides significant advantages from an agility perspective. That is the speed with which the team can experiment and validate various hypotheses. Moreover, the global scale of cloud is an attractive proposition for a lot of large enterprises. The key challenges continue to be cost. We have all heard stories of teams getting a sticker shock seeing their cloud bill. And mitigating such a risk needs a solid governance model. A well-defined governance model is also needed to mitigate security risks as well. In a hybrid model, the teams may choose to experiment on-prem and deploy on cloud, or vice versa. The key challenge here is the maturity of the team process, knowing which stuff is happening where and how it needs to be deployed onto the other infrastructure, and the need to integrate the feedback loop back into the development environment. So with that, let me pass it back to Yugal to walk you through a few case studies.
All right, thanks,
Yugal, over
Vinod.
to you.
Yeah, thanks. So we wanted to wrap up our talk with a couple real-life case studies, and then we'll go over a summary of key takeaways. So the first example is a recent project we had with a large pharmaceutical firm. And so this organization had the goal of developing an entire integrated platform to provide analytic insights. And part of this was a framework for model development and operationalization. So we developed a platform on Microsoft Azure, since this was their existing environment, and used scalable open source solutions for model development and deployment, while leveraging the Azure platform to monitor and manage the created models. And so this is a sort of a key philosophy, I think, remaining sort of platform agnostic and leveraging open source tools when you can is the key advantage to maintaining flexibility, and then also, doing what's necessary to integrate models within an existing environment. So the flexibility of open source allows you to sort of be agile and make those integrations in an efficient manner. And so the output from the models that were created were pushed to Power BI dashboards. The benefits of this kind of approach was a significant savings in infrastructure. So this is due to the hybrid open source approach, since there's no licensing fees for open source software. And there was also significant cost savings due to the shift from data science staff deploying models to DevOps staff handling operationalization. In addition to cost savings, there was additional efficiency gains due to automated workflows for model development and deployment and monitoring cycles. So in this example, we worked with a large healthcare provider to create a systematized approach for development of analytic solutions to help improve patient outcomes and optimize resource utilization. So our first approach was to onboard a hybrid team to develop and operationalize predictive models within their organization. We created a reusable framework to both develop and operationalize the models into their infrastructure. And here we leverage SPSS, since that was their existing platform. Model transparency is actually a key requirement here to allow for seamless model management, since we need to drive audits and rollbacks. And there's a lot of activity around sort of updating and rolling back models. So the transparency was necessary there. And so this approach allowed therapists to consume these outputs from the predictive models so they could focus on high-risk patients for readmissions. And this helped improve patient outcomes and sort of activities of daily living, which is a functional measure of how well patients are doing. So we wanted to end our discussion today with some key takeaways around operationalization in healthcare. So the first is around model deployment. Sorry, one second. Yeah, so the first is around model deployment. And here we talked about some best practices earlier, including PMML, web server, in-database approaches, and PFA. So we rank these according kind of popularity or usage within the PML right now is the most common. And again, this is a predictive modeling markup language that's used to make your model portable across environments. The next is the web service, which allows some additional flexibility by deploying your model as a web service that can be called by other applications. The in-database approach, which is building in the model into the data warehouse itself. And then finally, PFA, which is the new sort of standard that's emerging within the industry. This provides a common interface to safely deploy analytic workflows across a variety of environments and allows for more flexibility with computationally advanced models. So right now, this is sort of the least used in the industry because it's new, but it's gaining a lot of traction. So expect this to be sort of a common approach to start deploying models across environments. So the next key takeaway is to ensure when you're operationalizing, when you're deploying your model within the organization, is to ensure you understand the difference between the model development and model deployment environments. If they're different, choose the appropriate model deployment option that we talked about earlier. So understanding data privacy constraints and leveraging in-house privacy teams to ensure the model and underlying data are compliant before deployment. And finally, ensure the right expertise exists on your team and that data scientists are not spending their time operationalizing models that they develop. So with respect to model evaluation and monitoring, so ensure that there's a strong connect between the business problem at hand and strategies to evaluate and monitor deploy models. Don't emphasize model performance over the business problem being addressed. Sort of a corollary to this is ensure that model performance metrics align with business goals before operationalizing the model. And finally, choose automated monitoring tools when possible that can send alerts to relevant parties to address model degradation. And some of these, as mentioned before, are SAS, IBM, and TensorFlow. So around model management, so choose transparency over model performance whenever possible to ensure effective model management, auditing, and rollback, as well as establishing stakeholder buy-in. And keep track of model versions using well-known frameworks that can store model metadata in code, such as H2OAI, Microsoft R Server, SAS Model Manager. And finally, know how to address poor model performance by first evaluating the underlying model assumptions, and then recalibrate if model assumptions are still valid, or rebuild if the model assumptions are invalidated due to new data or business requirements. Recalibration can typically be accomplished with the DevOps team, but advanced algorithm modification or a complete rebuild of the model should be handled by the data science team. And finally, all of these steps ensure that each of these steps are being driven by a hybrid team consisting of data engineers, DevOps, data scientists, and data privacy experts that work together during each stage of the process. So with that, I think that's all we have for today for you, but we're happy to take any questions from the audience if we have any at this time.
Thank you, Yugal. To the audience, just a reminder, use the questions section in the GoToWebinar panel to submit your questions to our presenters. The first question, can you talk a little bit about what the typical skills are that would be required in an organization to manage and maintain a model?
Oh yeah, sure, I can take that one. So we talked a little bit about this, I think, in the presentation, but we would suggest, so this goes back to sort of the hybrid approach that we talked about before, and that team would consist of a data scientist, which would focus on algorithm development, a data engineer that could help with data cleaning and ETL processes, a DevOps expert to help with deployment, and then finally a data privacy expert to ensure that the model is being deployed in a compliant fashion.
Can you talk a little bit about how model performance is evaluated both positively and negatively?
Sure. So I think, there's a lot of ways to sort of understand how a model is performing, but in the healthcare domain, there's typically, so we talked about area under the curve, and this is an area under the curve from a rock plot. And this is kind of a common metric. It varies from 0 to 1. And you can think of it as an area under the curve of 0.5 can be thought of as essentially a 50% chance of guessing the right classification in a binary classification scheme. So have disease, not have disease, an AUC of 50% is basically a coin toss. An AUC greater than 0.5 is better than chance, and typical well-performing models in the industry can range from, for example, 0.7 to 0.9. This is a good sort of performance on a model, and tends to represent a good trade-off between sensitivity and specificity.
Is the process for deploying a model to the cloud different from deploying it on the premises?
So the steps to deploy to the cloud are a bit different. There may be additional steps around, say, provisioning of resources, permission model, maybe a quick sanity test, and then waiting for all the sessions to end before isolating, say, any previous version and then activating the new version. And the provisioning step by itself, it may take a finite amount of time, and that becomes an important consideration as well. There are tools that can assist with such automated deployment.
You talked about the skills required in an organization to manage and maintain a model. What's the total team size that would be required to operationalize a model?
Sure, I can take that one. And so this is a little bit of a tough question just because it really depends on the complexity of the model and the complexity of the deployment environment. But to start off with, I would say a minimum of at least one data scientist, one data engineer, one DevOps, and maybe a part-time data privacy expert, just to ensure that that the data is being handled properly. So this would ensure proper operationalization. So the complexity of the model and the deployment specifics may require more of certain skill sets. You know, if there's a sort of a technical or a complex sort of deployment environment, you may need more DevOps staff in order to handle some of the deployment, or if the algorithm is you know, very complex, you may need an additional data scientist to sort of augment the team. So it really depends, but I think that's sort of the minimum that you would need in order to be effective.
Okay, thank you. That was our last question. So with that, we'll conclude the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you Yugal and Vinil for the interesting and informative presentation. As a reminder to attendees, watch your email for a link to the recording as well as a PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. We look forward to seeing you at our next HIS Talk webinar, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everyone.